Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighbor who's Spider-Man. Well, then fame is ignored, action is his ring world. Look out, there goes the Spider-Man.
With great power comes great responsibility. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Bill and Frankie Pop Culture. I'm Frank. I'm going to talk you in here to what's going to be part one of a two-part, very Spidey-tastic episode, just in time for the theatrical release of Spider-Man Far From Home. In this first episode, what we're going to do is we're going to rank all of the live-action Spider-Man movies. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is not part of this, so don't at me, Holmes, okay? As you know, we were on a brief one-week hiatus due to Bill and Frank's Summit by the Sea, in which all of the great minds in podcasting were invited. Unfortunately, none of them showed up, so it was just Bill and I, and our good friend, Johnny Beaver, who just happens to be an expert in all things Spider-Man. Timely, right? So, enjoy part one of episode 8 of our Spidey-tastic special.
I have to say I am humbled and honored to be the very first guest on Bill and Frank Pop Culture. It's truly, truly one of the great experiences of my life.
Probably the first and only guest, but...
Well, I could be a frequent guest, so at least you'll have one repeating.
Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves, John. We got to see. We got to see how we come in sweeps this week. So, we're here at the first annual Bill and Frankie Pop Culture Summit at Sea, as we told you guys about last week. There's been sun, there's been sand, and the big question on everybody's mind, since Johnny skipped the water park this morning, has there been semen?
Has there been semen? There is a semen here now, depending on the definition of the word, as I am a former seaman.
Johnny's smoking a pipe and has a beard down to his chest, so I do feel like I'm sitting next to an old gnarled seaman.
This is interesting in that it's the first time we've ever done the podcast while looking at each other. It's a little distracting, to be honest.
It's kind of like the time you got that blowjob in college with me passed out right next to your pelvic area.
She could be listening to this.
I don't think so. All right. So, as promised last week, or 2 weeks ago, by the time you hear this, this is our Spidey-tastic episode, leading up to and building anticipation for Spider-Man Far From Home, which is going to close out Marvel's Phase 4.
3.
Correct, 3.
Okay, it's going to close out Marvel's Phase 3.
Which is interesting. You would imagine a movie called Endgame would be the end of something. But there's precedent. When Age of Ultron came out, people think that was when Phase 2 closed, but actually Ant-Man closed Phase 2. So they've done it before. They kind of like to have the big galactic crazy movie and then sort of...
A Fallout movie.
The Fallout movie that's slightly more personal, I think. I mean, Ant-Man was certainly smaller scale than, no pun intended, than Age of Ultron.
Smaller.
I'm sure it has a lot to do with how they're breaking the overall arc, and clearly we have a very big gap at the end of Endgame here as far as production and the way they're structuring the overarching story of these things, and Spider-Man Far From Home seems that it's going to fit more with what came before it and prep people for what's coming after, rather than being part of, say, the Eternals and Shang-Chi and some of these things that are much further down the line.
Right.
So I think it does make sense that this is part of Phase 4 or part of Phase 3 rather than being in Phase 4.
It certainly seems like Robert Downey's Spectre is going to be haunting this movie. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised, but also a little shocked at how hard it appeared to be leaning into that. Just based off the trailers, Iron Man's presence certainly seems to be a overriding theme, but we're getting ahead of our outline here.
We are, Bill, and because what we wanted to do first was, since we have the Spidey expert with us, Johnny Beaver, lover of all things Spider-Man. Well, not all things. We'll get to that later.
Yes. But loving to hate Spider-Man, loving to hate is part of what he loves.
Of any love affair.
Right.
Really. So I think the first thing we're going to do tonight is we're going to, kind of like we did with the Batman movies, is we're going to rank the Spider-Man movies. And just to be clear, no animation, live-action movies released in the theater. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So we have 6 entrants, and we'll talk through those. All right, so let's get into it.
All right, so we're going to do this just like we did Batman, where we talk about which one we hated the most first. It was easy with Batman. We were both super positive George Clooney was the worst Batman.
Yes.
So who wants to go first?
I think we let our guests go
first.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's polite.
Yeah, and we are nothing.
If not polite.
Correct.
So I definitely think Amazing Spider-Man 2 is the worst Spider-Man movie. The villain is atrociously bad.
Which villain?
Both of them. The story is minimal at best. The take on the comic books and a classic comic book story is butchered so poorly that it still frustrates me even now. That Gwen died in that way with Harry as the person who killed her. Really, more than anything, it comes down to just what a terrible villain Jamie Foxx is as Electro. That there's just nothing compelling about it. It goes in the pantheon of worst villain performances, I think, of all time. I think number 5 also has a couple of those as well when we get into it, but where you guys may have it as number 6. But I truly think that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is actually just flat out one of the worst comic movies ever made. And it killed a series.
Which is a shame, because Garfield's good. Garfield's pretty good as Spider-Man, and Emma Stone is pretty good also. It was a waste of talent.
There's a lot of chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, obviously in real life as well as on screen. I thought that came through much more effectively in the first movie than it did in the sequel. She looks like a John Romita drawing come to life, which is certainly a positive.
Right.
I can't understand why they wouldn't have had Dane DeHaan in the first movie if they kind of wanted to establish the Harry character and his heel turn in the second one. I think that would have been a much more effective move. Why they even bothered to have Norman Osborn in it at all? If he's just going to die in the first 20 minutes, an iconic villain like that. But again, really, Electro, we're talking late period Batman movies from the 90s level lousy villain. That's how bad he is.
Yeah, so I'll go next. We'll go counterclockwise. I'm really surprised. I thought, being how much you love the Tobey Maguire movies, that you would loathe 3 more than you hate Amazing Spider-Man number 2, because 3 also killed a series, which started out hot as shit. And me, when I think Spider-Man 3, I don't see much of a difference between Spider-Man 3 and X-Men Last Stand. I mean, it's got that same kind of feel to me, where the studio was like, all right, we've got this franchise that's making money, so a bunch of dudes in the room that don't know anything about comic books, how do we capitalize on this thing the most? Well, let's just put, more villains in it, and, not really focus on a coherent linear story. Let's just pound people with visuals and characters for the quick headlines and merchandising.
So you go Spider-Man 3 is...
I go Spider-Man 3 as 6, and I say this because I won't even watch it if I'm clicking past it on the channels. I don't even hesitate for a second.
Well, Spider-Man 3 is where, John, correct me if I'm wrong, the studio forced Venom on Raimi, correct?
That is accurate.
Yeah, he wanted to do. He was just going to tell a Sandman story.
Correct. So, yes, Raimi is much more of a 60s, 70s Spider-Man comic book fan. He really was not particularly interested in the Venom character or much of the 90s Spider-Man stuff. That was a studio mandate. Not to give away the farm here, but I have it in 5th place, so it's not like we're we're not that far apart here. I'll let Bill kind of dive into his 6th place before I start talking about it, but yeah, that's accurate.
So for me, I actually am going to land with Frank on this one. The two movies, Spider-Man 3 and Amazing Spider-Man 2, there's a lot of similarities, right? Like, you can lift Electro out of Amazing Spider-Man 2 and sort of not affect the movie at all. You can lift Sandman out
except for you lose cool visuals.
Kinda. And I think even more so with Sandman. Like, you can sort of lift him out of Spider-Man 3 and it doesn't change anything.
Exactly.
You lose some cool sand visuals. And part of me really wishes Raimi got to make the movie he wanted to make, because I feel like it would have been really good. Spider-Man 3 and Amazing Spider-Man 2 are neck and neck for shittiness. The reason I'm going to go with Spider-Man 3 is because, A, like Frank said, the quality of Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 was so high that the drop-off was more pronounced for me. And second, I fucking just love Venom. We'll get into this when we're talking about comics, but that's like holy grail territory for me. I love I don't know if he's my favorite Spider villain, but he's right up there. To go to the movie theater and see fucking Eric Foreman as Venom from that 70s show, I never quite got over it. It never worked for me at all. I thought when Peter was inflicted with the symbiote and became sort of emo, angry, dancing Peter, it just didn't strike me as like, when it happens to him in the comics, he like turns evil. In this one, he just like turns emo, which was, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I was never super in on the on Amazing 1 and 2, so it didn't. So 2 didn't hurt me as much in my heart.
Yeah.
3 was like a punch in the gut. Took the wind out of my sails.
Since Spider-Man came to theaters, it's like, oh man, I wonder when they're ever going to get to Venom and how awesome that's going to be. Again, not to give away the farm, but the quality of Spider-Man 2 is so high to drop off all the way to 3. That's why it makes me put it in last place. But again, it's like hairs.
So I have Spider-Man 3 in 5th place. And
so
I certainly agree.
So tell me, why is it better than Amazing 2?
Because I think Amazing 2, the worst sin you can commit is being boring. And Amazing 2 is actually outright boring. There's some good CGI work, but overall, I found the movie to be a slog where by the end of it, I just wanted to be out of the theater.
Not wrong.
There is a weirdness to Spider-Man 3 that does not work, but it is there are some scenes in that movie that are so strange. The emo Peter walking down the street thinking that the girls are attracted to him when in fact they actually are repulsed by him. The bizarre dance sequence when he brings Gwen to Mary Jane's club.
So weird.
The other bizarre dance sequence with Harry and Mary Jane, and the weird Harry is flirting with Mary Jane through line, and then of course he's actually being evil, and it is a very strange movie. It seems as though Raimi was frustrated by the shackles of the studio and decided that he had enough freedom to just do whatever the heck he wanted to do.
Because he knew
in
it was
some of it,
gone
because he
afterwards
had
anyway.
Pretty much decided, I'm not going to do this anymore. Yeah. And he really doesn't do anything anymore. He's directed, one movie since then, and produced a couple of other things.
From Hell? Was that?
He directed the Oz movie, and he's He did direct the one where the girl gets Drag Me to Hell. Drag Me to Hell. Yeah. So he's only directed 2 movies since then. We're talking over a decade. I somewhat agree with you. Do I want to revisit it frequently? No. When I see it on typically FX, do I sometimes stop and see where it is and maybe check in on it? Do I think there's some interesting themes that maybe weren't explored well, but at least attempted to be explored, as far as Spider-Man getting the key to the city, and what happens when, rather than being treated as an outcast, Peter is actually popular and people are huge fans of Spider-Man. Did they explore it well? No. Is it something that exists in the movie and can be analyzed? Yes. Is there anything like that in Amazing Spider-Man 2? I don't actually think so. The only way I really think Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a better movie is the computer-generated imagery is better, the fight scenes are better, but even those are unearned by the plot, by anything really going on with it. It's just a total mess. It also was beholden to a lot of studio gods as far as trying to set up a Sinister Six movie. Yeah. And, I think that's a theme with both of these movies is, the studios got involved. They wanted to see certain things, right, and those things got in the way of the vision. I don't know that Mark Webb actually has much of a vision, but whatever vision he had was totally corrupted in Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think Raimi got to do a little of the things that he wanted to do, and it's oddly enough, I think it's actually the Venom things and the symbiote costume being attached to Peter that really let him do those, and not his Sandman arc, which is an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
Why he would have ever, because apparently that was all him wanting Sandman to actually be his Uncle Ben's killer. Is why, yeah, why? That's a disaster. But I will say there are things about the movie that, while they don't work, were interesting things to have done. There's nothing to me that's even particularly interesting in Amazing Spider-Man 2.
So basically what I'm hearing is the mere fact that Bruce Campbell,
also accurate,
exists in 3 lifts it up above Amazing 2.
Sure. I mean, we have Raimi's old Buick in it. There's certain things that show up in the Raimi movie that we got to see. So.
And now that hearing you talk about it that way, it's interesting. No, it's interesting. Sony eventually sort of policed themselves. Like, they interfered with Raimi's trilogy and it sent it crashing down. Then they interfered in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and it was such a colossal disaster that they were like, we need help. We don't know how to do this.
Kevin Feige, help us?
Yeah, and essentially, how badly they mangled Amazing Spider-Man 2 is the reason we got Tom Holland in Civil War. As much as that was a disappointing movie, like, maybe we're not where we are now without it. It's very difficult for me to imagine right now Infinity War and Endgame without Tom Holland in them.
Yeah.
So, that's pretty cool.
So, I'm going to say 5th. Then is, we don't have to talk about it anymore. Yeah. Is obviously Amazing 2 for me. Like I said, the difference was how much I was into the Raimi movies versus the Amazing movies. That when 2 sucked, I really, to be honest, I didn't think Amazing was that great. So when 2,
I feel like I might know where your number 4 is going.
when 2 sucked, I was I wasn't shocked. It
makes me feel good, though. I feel like, when I sat down to think about this, I was like, there's a giant, to me, there was a considerable drop off from the top 4 to 5 and 6. And it feels like we're all on the same page.
Yeah, see, I don't, it's like, well, let's get to, I don't want to go there yet. All right. So back to Johnny then. So where are we with, your number 4?
So my number 4 is Amazing Spider-Man, or Amazing Spider-Man 1. The things that work in this movie are the chemistry, as we noted earlier, between Garfield and Emma Stone, which is much more present in this film than it is in the sequel. I also like her father. I think he's great. I think Dennis Leary is great in it.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Bizarrely enough, it seems that the thing that people remember most about this movie is Branzino, which I think, again, says
that's what I was just thinking about.
It's weird you said that. How little people really gave a crap about the Andrew Garfield movies. Garfield is too old for the role, which so was Tobey Maguire, but he is a comic book fan in real life. I think he wanted to make good Spider-Man movies. I think the studio failed him. I think Mark Webb is as much as I enjoy 500 Days of Summer, was not the right director to take over this franchise. Again, Emma's great in it. She literally looks like a John Romita character come to life. It's fantastic. Again, a frankly more interesting than Electro, but mostly not interested in the villain. Lizard didn't really work. I like Rice Ifans and other stuff, Notting Hill and whatnot, but just didn't work in this.
Xenophilius Lovegood?
Of course.
Sure. If you want to go that way instead of the crazy roommate from Notting Hill, that's fine.
Or the kicker from Replacements.
Yes, which actually may be his finest role. It just was a story that didn't need to be told again. I'm really happy that when we got Homecoming, they did not feel the need to revisit Peter's origin for a third time. This obviously is one of the classics comic book origin stories, but we certainly didn't need it 3 times in 15 years, and we probably didn't even need it twice in 10. It's not again, you can see when we talk about some of the Raimi movies, some of the things that are not great are going to be some of the CGI and things like that. It's much improved when they got to Amazing Spider-Man. The second unit production and things like that are much better, but it's just a movie that exists mostly because Sony had this valuable IP and wanted to make sure they kept producing it, more so than because there was an artistic reason for this franchise to be rebooted at that time. That being said, I can rewatch it. It's not boring the way Amazing Spider-Man 2 is.
I can rewatch it because of so it's also my number 4.
Sure.
Mine too.
I can rewatch it because of that new fresh chemistry between Peter and Gwen in it. I also really like Dennis Leary in it. I also I didn't love what they did with the Lizard. To me, it's the thing that was always super scary about the Lizard was that he was a humanoid lizard. And they made him
a velociraptor.
A huge velociraptor. The Lizard was scary when he was a lizard wearing a lab coat.
Yeah.
This was Hulk lizard that resembled nothing human.
And I don't want to step on your line or Bill's here, but the Lizard is a character in the comics that has a lot of pathos. He's sort of almost an inverted Hulk character in that he's villainous, but Kirk Connors has no control over what happens when he's a lizard, and I didn't think the script did Rice Ifans any favors as far as making the Kirk Connors character sympathetic so that he was trapped in this awful situation, because I think they were worried that he wouldn't be villainous enough if that was the case, which was a giant mistake.
That's what made the Lizard an interesting character. It wasn't because of what he did when he was the Lizard. It was because how regretful and ashamed of it he was when he was Dr. Connors.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering right, in Amazing Spider-Man, Rhys Ifans' Kirk Connors is sort of a dick right off the bat.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
Kirk Connors in the comic books is a sweetheart.
Yeah, the Dylan Baker version of him that they sort of peppered into the Raimi movies is actually closer to what Kirk Connors is supposed to be, more mentor-y. I got that right, Dylan Baker?
I'm so happy that Bill is here because I was really trying to think of the actor's name who played it in the Raimi movies, and Bill is here to save us.
Yeah. I mean, I think he only has a couple lines in Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2, but it's clearly something that Raimi was toying with. I don't know if he ever would have got to it or not, but I mean, he introduced the character for a reason. That's how I imagine Kirk Connors. When he's Kirk Connors, he seems like he's a genuinely good guy, and he's very inverted Hulk is a great way to put it. Except he has zero memory of anything he does when he's a lizard and feels terrible about it.
Yeah, in the comics, he has a family and a wife and a kid.
And he's always sort of hunting for or trying to concoct the serum that'll cure him of his lizardness.
So he doesn't hurt his family, and
so Amazing Spider-Man is 4 for me too. And the other thing that boggles my mind about Amazing Spider-Man on a very taking story out of it and all that stuff is the CGI had obviously come a long way, because the stuff with Peter with Spider-Man is great, but I thought the CGI on Lizard is terrible.
It is
not even just the choice they made to make him Hulk Lizard and not lab coat Lizard, like you said, but he just looks fake. It looks terrible. I thought it was worse than movies that had come a long time before it. It took me out of it. It was bad enough to take me out of it when I was watching it the first time. Yeah, it's weird. I rewatched Amazing Spider-Man not that long ago, maybe a month, and I was sort of stunned a little bit at how much worse it was than I thought.
Well, I think because when it came out, everybody likes Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, and everybody wanted it to be so good. And when it first came out, everybody was a lot more positive about it than we probably should have been, because we wanted it to work, because we liked Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker and Spider-Man. And rewatchability,
I'll watch it,
but I won't go looking for it.
Right. Before we even go further, John, tell me if I'm wrong, but there was at one point a script and a direction Sam Raimi was taking it for Spider-Man 4, and then negotiations fell apart. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Most of my understanding is it's very much the same way that Tim Burton and Michael Keaton were supposed to be doing a Batman 3, but the studio was pretty much ready to move on after Batman Returns. Yes, Raimi was willing to come back for Spider-Man 4. Apparently a lot of things were going to have to be renegotiated with him, as well as with Toby and Kirsten Dunst and the major players, and the studio was... Although Spider-Man 3, I believe, is still the highest grossing of all the Spider-Man movies. Yeah. But the studio...
Makes me so mad.
Was not particularly happy with the direction. They were right. I mean, look, we hammer the studios all the time, but these people are out to make money, and that at the end of the day is what they have to look out for the best interest of their shareholders. And I think they watched Spider-Man 3 and realized they need to go in a new, fresh direction. But yes, my understanding is very similar to the situation that Burton and Keaton were in after Batman Returns, where they were more interested than the studio was. But I do feel like when you watch Spider-Man 3, you can get the sense that Raimi knew this was kind of it. Yeah.
So let's go to number 3 then, Johnny. Who's your number 3?
So this was outright the most difficult decision in this ranking. Was between second and third place. I'm going to do Spider-Man Homecoming as my number 3 movie. There is a massive gap between the top 3 and bottom 3 here. I absolutely adore all 3 of the top 3 movies, and the other 3 are shrug-worthy to outright awful. As far as Spider-Man Homecoming, as I mentioned earlier, I'm really happy they did not feel the need to revisit Peter's origin again. I really enjoy the father-son relationship between Tony and Peter.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Michael Keaton is a gangbusters villain, which is going to be a theme for why the top 3 movies are the top 3 movies, is the villains really work. Holland has a lot of energy and really gets the quips that come along with being Peter Parker. Some of the scenes, I think one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie is the scene where he's trapped in the vault in DC, and he's just talking to his suit AI for an entire night, because it really captures just kind of what a goofy, fun character Spider-Man is and why I relate to him so much. Because it's kind of the weird thing I would probably do if I was in the same situation. I had an AI to talk to. The biggest indictment I can make a movie is that it's outright boring, which is what I would say about Amazing Spider-Man 2. The second biggest indictment is it's completely unnecessary, which is what I'd say about Amazing Spider-Man 1. And then if it's outright bad, like Spider-Man 3, this is none of those things. I think the character needed a refresh. The box office didn't necessarily reflect that. It did well, but not as well as the Raimi trilogy. But I thought it really just worked on every level and really understood the character very well. I love Keaton. The scene where in the car between Keaton and Holland, and he's so good in that scene. It's a great movie. It's a ton of fun. When I was a kid in the 80s, this would have been my favorite Spider-Man movie. So when I first started reading Spider-Man comics, I would have actually had this above Spider-Man 1 and 2 as the best, because I think it's a great movie for kids too. Because again, the actor wasn't too old for the part. He actually seems like a high schooler, and it totally makes sense that way, which makes him more relatable to kids. If there's anything I think that doesn't work, it's almost weirdly something that also works for it, which is I somewhat wish it could have stood more on its own and been less of a Avengers adjacent movie and more willing to just be a Spider-Man movie. But it's a great movie. You know, the other things that don't work, I don't think there's really any chemistry between Holland and Zendaya. I don't know why they felt the need to rewrite the MJ character that way.
Is there supposed to be yet?
I don't know. I'm not. I mean, clearly they're hinting at it more so in the sequel.
Early reviews of Far From Home have commented on that there is the chemistry is much better between.
Yeah, because I kind of felt like the character that they wrote in that movie for MJ was like the kind of character that's not supposed to have chemistry with anybody.
Yeah. Well, certainly a reimagining of MJ for sure.
Yeah, who has chemistry with everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not like the final fight scene. I did like the lead up. I liked that they did a bit of a takeoff of Amazing Spider-Man 33 where he has to lift the building off of himself to chase down the Vulture, but I thought the final fight scene on the beach in Coney Island was muddled at best and kind of hard to follow. The Staten Island ferry scene is a much better fight set piece, which is actually fairly typical of a lot of the MCU movies.
Yeah.
Is the best action sequence usually comes somewhere in the middle rather than at the end, which is kind of odd. But I've noticed that in several MCU movies that's been the case, whether it be Civil War with the airport battle scene or Winter Soldier with the fight scene in the elevator. That tends to happen a lot, you know. But it's a great movie. I love that Tony Stark's in it. You know, do I think that maybe it takes away from the focus of Peter Parker a little bit? Sure. But, you know, I love that he's in it. I love that he kind of has the hots for Aunt May. I love that in both Civil War and this one, it's because Downey and Marissa Tomei actually dated in real life, that there actually is some real chemistry between them. You know, these things are great things about them. You know, Feige and company clearly understand and love these characters, and it shows in this film, and it's a great movie. And it being in third place is really more a statement of how much I love the first two Raimi movies than it is anything about this film.
Yeah, so I mean, my number 3 is Spider-Man, and it's not really an indictment on Spider-Man. I mean, there's a couple of, like, I guess I like Michael Keaton better as the villain, better than I like Dafoe. I never liked the Green Goblin mask in Spider-Man. I felt like it was a cop out to
take him out of the green and purple jerkin.
Yeah, like, you know, that's like, you know, I felt like they were like, how are we going to make him look like a fucking goblin? I'll put him in a mask, you know. But like I said, I mean, those are little tiny stupid things. You know, when that movie, when Spider-Man first came out, it was like, holy shit, finally, you know, I mean, when you watched it, you believed it could exist. Like, just the way it was done and his suit and you know, plus Toby's just a fucking great actor, and so is Dafoe, but I'm a Michael Keaton mark, so even though he wasn't my favorite Batman, check back episode 5 for that. But yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about it.
I'm on the same page as you. Spider-Man comes in at number 3 for me. Like you both have said, it's really tough to make a choice here. I had a lot of the same problems. I think Green Goblin's costume is terrible. I actually think James Franco is really bad in the first Spider-Man. He gets better in 2, and then 3 I have a hard time blaming him for because the script doesn't help him very much. He has to sort of heel babyface turn a bunch of times in that movie, and it's bad. I mean, you go back in time, that movie was a revelation watching it the first time. Where I feel like Bryan Singer's X-Men sort of cracked the door open for comic book movies. Spider-Man then fully kicked it.
I think the other thing is, for me, it's kind of when I started to realize that Kirsten Dunst isn't that hot.
I think she's a good actress. She was not. Actually, Mary Jane Watson has yet to be cast well, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of I mean, I'm just used to looking at MJ and seeing the sort of buxom
redhead.
Yeah, not Kirsten Dunst to me. Again, though, like both Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire were both too old to be playing the parts they were. Everybody was too old to be playing the parts they were playing in Spider-Man. I actually really like Dafoe in the movie. Willem Dafoe in the movie when he's out of the mask, out of the costume. I think he's a really good Norman Osborn. I think there are a couple scenes in that movie that really crackle. In particular, when Dafoe comes over to Harry's place for Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
it's a really good. It's sort of. I like that scene just as much, not just as much, but I like that scene in the same way as I like the car scene with Keaton in Homecoming, where there's a lot of tension going on. You don't know how much either person knows, sort of thing. But yeah, that's where I'd put Spider-Man 1 at number 3. You know, what's funny is I remember back in the day when that movie opened, and I think it opened to something in the 70 millions for opening weekend. And I remember it being like, or maybe it was 93. Was it 93?
Yes.
93 million. I remember it being like, wow, like nothing's ever going to touch that. And Avengers just opened to 300 million in 3 days, which is just a sign of how far these things have come.
So I'm going to just do something different here because I think I'm going to take a guess here and say that our number 2 was Johnny's number 3. Do you agree with that?
No.
Oh, really? I just ruined the whole show.
So I have Spider-Man 1 as number 2. I cannot express how much I adored this movie when it came out. And in hindsight, are there a lot of problems with it? Do I agree with a lot of things you pointed out? The CGI from 2002 clearly does not work on rewatches in 2019. The Goblin costume is not great, but I saw this movie 7 times in the theaters, which is the second most I've ever seen any movie in the theaters after the original 89 Batman. That's how much I love this movie. I kind of remember getting into a conversation with Bill's father about why I love Fellowship of the Ring, and I had it sometimes I actually thought it was better than the other two, and he said, well, that doesn't make sense. The story's not as good. And I said, that's true, but I just never thought I would ever see that on screen. And then I got this opportunity to see it on screen. And I had literally spent over 20 years of my life dreaming of seeing Spider-Man on screen. And boy, did Raimi and Tobey Maguire absolutely give me everything I wanted to see. You know, a great origin story. At the time, yes, there was some stuff where you're like, that's definitely computer animated, but they couldn't do this stuff.
Yeah, you can't hold that against that because it's what was available at the time.
You know, the performances, you know, I thought Dafoe didn't have a template the way a lot of these actors do now for how to be a comic book villain, so he went kind of campy. And at the time, a lot of the base was these Batman movies and the Batman series from like the 60s. So he certainly leaned into the campier elements, but I thought they did have a through line with him kind of thinking of himself as a father figure and Peter not acknowledging that. Raimi hired a lot of his sort of repertory of actors from his previous films who are all really great character actors. Rosemary Harris is much better Aunt May as far as being like the comic books than either of her two successors. Uncle Ben's great. J.K. Simmons is so good as Jonah Jameson. He's so good. He just chews scenery in exactly the right way. And, you know, whatever we might say about Tobey Maguire now, he's clearly kind of an oddball, possibly a dick. But he filled the movie with a sense of wonder. He went through this guy was skinny as a rail, and he bulked up for the role. He looks like the character. He's so earnest. The quips and things like that don't work the way they do in the Marvel movies, which really have learned how to spin the Whedon speak well. And Raimi, as we talked about with Spider-Man 3, he loves the 60s and 70s Spider-Man stuff. And that's where he's coming from. And that's kind of what he's mining from as far as his storytelling. And those comics could be kind of goofy. And there's a level of goofiness, but he also brings that horror movie director element to it as well. the finale fight scene is actually pretty violent, and maybe not super appropriate for little kids, but again, being able to see the Queensboro Bridge stuff, sure, they subbed Mary Jane in for Gwen, and she doesn't die. Spoilers for a movie from that long ago. But, it's, being able to see that stuff on screen and remembering how I felt about that movie in 2002, even the things that really are kind of painful now, you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us, you mess with Spidey, you mess with New York. You have to remember, right, this is 9 months after 9/11, right? Yeah. They had to pull the posters that had the Twin Towers down and a teaser trailer that had the Twin Towers in it. People wanted to see this kind of stuff. This movie did as well, as Bill was mentioning, in part because this is kind of the state of mind America had in 2002, and they really wanted to see something that filled people with hope in a pretty grim time. And it captured that escapism that people wanted at the time. And it also laid the emotional groundwork for my number one favorite, in that, do I think Kirsten Dunst is exactly the way I imagine Mary Jane? No. Kirsten and Toby did date, so there's some chemistry there as well. Does she really work exactly the way I picture Mary Jane? No, but I mean, come on, like the upside down kiss it had to work like that kind of a movie, right? The X-Men movie was like a movie for comic book nerds and action movie junkies. This one got the Titanic audience in, because people were like, it actually was a romantic movie as well. And, it just really worked on a lot of different levels. And I think even more so than X-Men showed Hollywood how successful these movies could be. And I think there are a lot of templates in this film that Kevin Feige and company ended up using, certainly much more. So they took a lot more cues from this movie and Spider-Man 2 than they did from anything Christopher Nolan was working on, to say the least. It's a fun movie. It's eminently rewatchable, even if it's to kind of make fun of some of the lousier CGI. But and again, Raimi has some distinctive qualities. He is not a run-of-the-mill director that you just plug and play. I think Marvel's had a lot of success with bringing in these sitcom and television directors, but part of the reason for that is they're willing to kind of fall into line. And Raimi had some really distinctive visual styles and some distinctive comedy that may or may not work, and didn't work in Spider-Man 3, but it really did work here. You can't fault sort of I've heard people say, like, Seinfeld sucks. It's like, well, because everything that you like now about sitcoms is from Seinfeld. Yeah. And you just don't realize it if you didn't watch Seinfeld at the time. Almost everything that we're watching in a lot of these comic movies now probably wouldn't exist if Spider-Man 1 hadn't been as successful as it was at doing those things and really leaning into being a comic book. Again, X-Men 1, they're all wearing black leather, and they don't lean into the comic book trappings in a lot of ways. This movie was outright proud to be a comic book movie.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
And they didn't probably have the free reign that they've had since then to make these kind of movies, and it was really Raimi that set that tone. And it's a great movie.
So this is why I wanted to have Johnny on, because once he gets gushing, it's pretty.
I couldn't express that any better if I tried.
So, I mean, my number 2 is Far From Home. We split Batman's dick hairs before. Now we're split Spider-Man's dick hairs. The Far From Home being set in the current MCU. They did such a good job bringing him into Civil War, and then this was kind of like the continuation of that. His relationship with Tony Stark, which, there is a point in the comics where that exists, and I doubt that there's anybody on the planet that couldn't have just awesome, bubble over the top chemistry with Robert Downey Jr. Because he's just like, he's
the Daniel Bryan of the MCU.
He is.
His work rate makes everyone better.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He could put anybody over, and I love Jon Favreau being in it. And I love Tony only being accessible to Peter when he wants to be. Like, he loves him, but he's still Tony Stark, so he loves him on his terms. And then Michael Keaton is just, they bring in a veteran like Michael Keaton who, Michael Keaton can be the funniest guy on the planet when he wants to be. But he can also be fucked up, sadistic. What was that movie called? Pacific Heights, and Clean and Sober. Like, he can be
Beetlejuice.
Yeah, I mean, he can pretty much do it all. And for him to be cast as a supervillain, it was just it worked perfectly. So anyway, I'm not going to go on any more about it, but yeah, I mean, for me, Far From Home is number 2. Tom Holland, the youngest Spider-Man we've had. His chops are so good. And you can tell he just loves being Spider-Man. 100% just enjoyable.
So I feel like I'm the controversy. For me, my number 2 is Spider-Man 2, which I know most people regard as the best Spider-Man movie, and I get why, and I love it. Like, it's like I said, the difference between 1, 2, and 3 here is not a lot of stuff. Tobey and Kirsten Dunst had really come into their roles at this point. Raimi knew what he was doing. He was hot off the success of how successful Spider-Man was, and I think he was given virtual free reign to do whatever the fuck he wanted in this movie. He built a incredibly compelling villain in Otto Octavius, an inspired casting choice, which I feel like if there's any evidence that Raimi was free to do whatever he wanted, he cast Alfred Molina, who's not well known to the public at large. I feel like you can almost not get away with that now. Like, casting the villain, you couldn't cast somebody that didn't have a name as much as he didn't at that point. And sometimes when Spider-Man succeeds at its best level, there's a mentor-student relationship, and I feel like the Alfred Molina Tobey Maguire chemistry and relationship is better than he had with Willem Dafoe in the first movie.
Tons miles better.
Peter almost seems more anguished to be going after Otto in Spider-Man 2 than he was to be going after his best friend's father in Spider-Man 1, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, because that's not the way it is. I mean, in the comics, it's the Osborn-Parker relationship is the most tragic relationship, or one of the most. And I almost think they did it better here with Otto. Also, the CGI is much better. There are still some scenes where it's very clear that Otto is CGI'd and looks sort of fake. And then there's the subway scene, which I really don't like, where they're passing him like he's Jesus.
Where he's unmasked.
Yeah, where he's unmasked and they're passing him like he's Jesus, which I'm not a huge fan of. I thought that was a little heavy-handed. But again, it's the reason I put this at number 2 and not number 1 are the same, kind of the same issues I've always had. Is we never get to spend any time with Tobey Maguire really, very little in high school, because he's quite frankly too old for it and it looks silly. Kirsten Dunst was never my favorite, and it's sort of just like doubling down on the first one, where it's great and all, but it's not exactly what I imagined. And then I didn't think the one thing that bothers me about Spider-Man 2 is like none of the action set pieces to me stick out as ultra memorable, which I feel like I'm going to get a disagreement from John just sort of looking at his face right now. But when I think about, like, I had to actually, without going back and watching the movie, I had to kind of try hard to remember what the set pieces were, which I don't know whether that's, I could remember one more clearer than I could 2 right off the bat.
The one that comes to my mind, like right out of the gate, is the whole sequence from when he robs the bank.
Yes.
And then the fight climbing up the side of the building, right, with Aunt May. That's like the first thing that comes to mind. And to me, that was like a comic book just moving.
Right. Some of that CGI does not hold up.
Right. Yeah. But at the time, it was like,
sure.
What the fuck? I mean, your head was exploding because you'd never seen anything like it. And, I mean, that's the first one that comes to mind to me as far as a set piece and a sequence in the movie.
So, Bill, do you want
to cut you off?
Do you want to talk about, since we've talked about
why don't you talk about number 1?
Do you want to talk about Homecoming and then
sure.
we'll talk about Spider-Man 2?
Sure. So I knew I was going to kind of be in the minority here. having Homecoming as my favorite Spider-Man movie. And I sort of, I don't want to say agonized about it, but I had to think about it really hard because I didn't know if I wanted to pick the Spider-Man movie that is sort of beholden to the MCU to be my number one. Part of me really wanted to pick one where it was like a Spider-Man movie that stands on its own. But when it came down to it, I'm talking about if Spider-Man Homecoming is a 9.9, then Spider-Man 2 is a 9.89. Like, it's that close. And for me, what puts it over the top, and this is always what's important to me, is that Tom Holland, to me, is the first actor to embody Spider-Man the way I have always wanted Spider-Man to be embodied. And that's not, I mean, part of that is that he's age appropriate, but he's the first one to really get the wiseacre, smart aleck, quippy Spider-Man down to a side. Like, John described it perfectly. Tobey brought this sort of sense of wonder to it and the sort of earnest goofiness that Tobey Maguire has, and that's great. But to me, that's not exactly in sync with the Spider-Man I love the most, which is I knew Tom Holland was my Spider-Man the instant he was swinging around the airport in Civil War making the Empire Strikes Back joke with the AT-ATs. I was like, this is the guy. This is how right in that 2 minutes, he had the quippy Spider-Man down better than both Maguire and Garfield could ever have done. And to me, that's what puts it over the top.
In the Zendaya depiction of Mary Jane doesn't bother you?
It bothers me a little, but it doesn't bother me that much more than Kirsten Dunst's interpretation. Like, not enough. I also think we sort of haven't seen enough of what they plan to do with her to judge it, because she's very minor in the first, super minor. You don't even know her name's MJ until the last 2 seconds of the movie. Really, it's the other chick,
Keaton's daughter.
Yes, that's the central female in the home. Like, I'm reserved. You know what? Maybe if we do this again in a couple of years, it'll change. If they have done something horrible with Zendaya. But I'm sort of reserving judgment on her.
No, the only reason I ask is because they made her like a mousy kind of introvert.
It's different.
I mean, like, I'm not talking about the race thing or anything like that, but
no,
they made her like a mousy.
They changed her personality.
Like,
yeah,
she reminds me of, like, they made her like it's like they followed my niece Kayla around.
Yeah,
and they made her like that. Like, she's she's introverted, she's quiet, she's
quirky,
super snarky.
Yeah.
Whereas MJ was always like, "Hey, Tiger, let's go dance," and like,
Well,
you go do that. I'm gonna dance the night away.
I never saw Mary Jane as being above it all and too cool for school. That was not my pick. And
yeah, she was superficial, and
I read the depiction of her in that film.
I agree. So, and one of the other things before I let you guys...
I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, one of the other things before I let you guys take over, too, is one of the things I liked about this version of Spider-Man is, honestly, there's no Harry Osborn in the movie to sort of muddle things. Because I felt like every time they brought Harry in, it was great, but it ended up muddling things more. And I liked getting to see him in school as an age-appropriate teenager. I liked that the centerpiece of this thing was a homecoming dance. Like, that felt very Spider-Man to me.
Yeah.
It didn't feel,
it was like a high school movie with a superhero.
Exactly. And that's essentially where I ended up coming down. Like, why I ended up coming down the way I came down. Even now, I'm second-guessing myself a little bit because that and Spider-Man 2 are so close.
Because Johnny's staring daggers at you.
Right. But, I mean, to me, it's like... here's how strongly I feel about it. I feel like if you take Tom Holland out of Homecoming and put Tobey Maguire in it and put Tom Holland in Spider-Man 2, then Spider-Man 2 would be the best Spider-Man movie. That's how much stock I put in his performance.
In Holland.
Yeah, in Holland.
So I will say, in agreement with you, that if I had to rank the best actors playing Spider-Man, I would actually have Tom Holland above Tobey Maguire.
Yeah.
And I totally agree on this one. And I also think that as far as understanding the quippiness and things like that, that movie got it more than the Raimi movies did. And I don't want to move over to my number one unless you feel like you've got it.
Go for it.
Okay, so we've already gone long, and I could literally gush about Spider-Man 2 for hours on end. And I love talking about this movie.
We'll cut this bitch up and make it a two-parter.
So we had a conversation the other night here during our Seaside Summit, or whatever we're calling it, Summit at Sea. There are certain movies where, regardless of the plot mechanics, they really just hit a comic book tone. And I'm not talking about this is a Dark Phoenix story. I'm talking about this feels like a comic book come to life. And they're not always the best comic book movies. I would include Captain America, the First Avenger in this. I would include X-Men First Class, which Bill and Frank are not huge fans of. The Rocketeer, which is, I'm a Rocketeer truther for life. And Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2. I think Spider-Man 2 is as close to a perfect comic book movie as has ever been produced. There are days when I think it is the best comic book movie ever made. There are also days when I can be convinced that The Dark Knight is the best comic book movie ever made, or Avengers Endgame is the best comic book movie ever made. As far as tightly plotted, I actually think Captain America: The Winter Soldier could be described as the best comic book movie ever made. As far as a film, Spider-Man 2, I just adore everything about this movie. And I really want to talk about some specific scenes in this movie that speak to why I love it so much. So I agree. I don't think the action set pieces are what sets this movie apart. I really like especially the early part of the train sequence, which really is almost a through line from Doc Ock kidnapping Mary Jane in the cafe to Peter meeting him on the tower, and then they fight on the tower and they tumble down. This was very, again, early in CGI, when they really couldn't figure out how to do a human being in CGI unless they were wearing a mask and looked like Spider-Man. So there's some very dodgy CGI with Doc Ock in a lot of these scenes, but when they first tumble down on top of the train, and then, because I was actually just watching this on FX this week, or last week, and it's just dynamite. There's a scene where they're fighting on top of the train, and then Doc Ock throws Peter off of the train, and he swings his webs and goes through an overpass and goes in between these gaps, and then lands back on the train, and then Doc Ock tosses him off again, and he webs onto the train and gets dragged on the concrete and then pulls himself back onto the train, and it's absolutely fantastic. It holds up even now. But I don't really want to talk about the action, because the moments that make this movie great have very little to do with the action sequences. The first 5 minutes of this movie encapsulate everything that you need to know about Spider-Man as a character. He shows up to work. He's late to work. He has to get pizzas to a location, but within a half hour, he only has 10 minutes left. So first he's on his little crappy moped. He almost gets run over by a bus, so he decides to swing over as Spider-Man. But he's got to save a little girl. So then he drops the pieces off on somebody's balcony, swings down, saves the girl, tells her to watch herself in traffic, then swings back up, grabs the pizzas, shows up at the location in the broom closet, spends an inordinate amount of time trying to get the brooms back into the closet, and then goes up to the reception desk where a young Emily Deschanel, pre-Bones, gives him a sassy look and says, "You're late. I ain't paying for those." And Peter goes back to work and he gets fired, because that's Spider-Man in a nutshell, where Spider-Man just gets his Spidey persona screws over his Peter persona, right? And then the movie takes that as a through line for the rest of the film, right? So, yes, one of my other favorite scenes, in fact, my favorite scene with Melina in the entire movie, is when they're talking about science, right? Peter shows up to talk to him as part of his ESU class, and they just end up, Doc Ock and his wife asking about his girlfriend, and they're talking about, science that they love. And I agree, it works better as a father-son relationship, and this is, again, a theme through all these Spider-Man movies, is they need to have a father figure for him to replace Uncle Ben, and why none of these seem to work until Tony Stark to some extent. But it's a great scene, and it really gives you the pathos that we're talking that they didn't have with Kurt Connors in Amazing Spider-Man. They didn't feel the need to really, really ham up Doc Ock the way they did Willem Dafoe. I think they realized they could have a little more of an intelligent villain that didn't just have to be outright villainous all the time and could actually have a little bit more nuance to him. And it's a great performance from Molina. But really, to me, the center of this entire film is Peter being hard luck Spidey, right? You know, showing him in the laundromat, accidentally turning the rest of his stuff pink because he threw his Spider-Man suit in with the rest of his stuff.
It's a lot of the sad sack Peter stuff. Yeah.
Losing his powers, and you know how overjoyed he is for a while, and the whole raindrops keep falling on my head scene, and you know he's so happy about it, and it's direct. They literally pulled a direct shot from Amazing Spider-Man number 50, you know, where he throws the costume in the trash, and you know he thinks like, "Oh, I finally don't. This responsibility it's off my shoulders. I don't have to do this anymore, right?" And then. But, you know, he does. This is who he is. This is what he learned from his Uncle Ben. I know how much they've hammered the great power, great responsibility. By the time we got to the Garfield movies, no one wanted to hear about it anymore. But this one, more so than Spider-Man 1 or any of them, really gets at why I love this character so much. And we talk about the comics, why this character is so important to me in my life and is my favorite fictional character ever. Because they really get why this character is so relatable. You know, Frank loves Batman. I love Spidey because, sure, he has superpowers, and yet I'm so much more like Peter Parker than I could ever be like Bruce Wayne. He's so much more like a person that you would meet and what you would really deal with if you were going to be a superhero on a day-to-day basis. And Spider-Man 2 really understands that in a way that I don't think any of the other Spider-Man movies did. The reason why I don't have Homecoming number 1 is this just seemed like something I didn't even really want to touch. I mean, there's some elements of it, but it really was not something that they explored in depth. And this, to me, is the crux of this character is, you know, he doesn't always want to be Spidey. And Spidey is more of a burden than it is a benefit to him a lot of the time. But, you know, he has this responsibility because if he doesn't do it, no one else is going to do it. And, you know, it's a lesson that he learns in Spider-Man 2 and learns in a really effective way. You know, again, I think it builds a lot off of the finale of the first Spider-Man movie as far as, you know, him saying that he can't be with Mary Jane. If they just ended this, if Raimi had also been a duology, you know, it's a nearly perfect ending. Even the kind of weird, bittersweet way that Raimi films the final shot where she shows up, she leaves her wedding, she comes to see Peter because, you know, she has to be with the man she loves. But with that final shot where he swings away from his apartment and it goes in on her, and there's a little bit of concern, like, did she make the right decision? Because he's always going to also have to be Spider-Man. And that's, you know, that's something she's saying she can live with, but it is a tough thing to live with. And, you know, it really acknowledges that not everything about being Spider-Man is fun. And it is a bit of a burden. And I love the movie for doing that. And it's just a great movie.
I will say, though, I do think they do hit that in Homecoming. Like, in the middle of the movie, he wants to go to the party, you know, with his friend, and he wants to go impress what's-her-face, I can't even remember her name, Keaton's daughter, and he has to leave because...
She's Liz, right?
Liz. And he has to leave because danger rears its ugly head, and he misses the party, he disappoints his best friend, all that stuff. And then at the end, he just wants to go to the damn dance, and he can't. I mean, it's not quite on the same level, maybe, as what happens in Spider-Man 2, because that Spider-Man is sort of dealing with more adult things at that point, like being in love and trying to hold down a job and all that stuff, and his Spider-Man persona keeps getting in the way. And Tom Holland's is more high school. But I certainly got the sense watching that movie that there were times where he's like, I just want to be a high school kid. I want to go to the dance. You know, I've asked this girl to dance, and she's unexpectedly said yes. And I just want to go with her. Of course, he shows up and realizes that the Vulture is her dad, and that kind of throws a wrench into it right away. But I do feel like while they didn't understand it, I don't think, like you said, I don't think they understood it as good as Raimi did. But I do think that they tried to make the point that this kid is not juggling the same thing as Captain America's juggling. He's juggling trying to be a high school kid and a superhero at the same time.
Sure, and I mean they certainly hit that point in the finale when he decides he wants to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man,
Yeah.
and he. But one of the reasons why I had Homecoming as number 3 is, did they earn that moment? Sure, I think they did, but he does spend most of the movie just kind of wanting to prove that he's really an Avenger, right? And that to me is not necessarily the Spidey character. I think there's a lot as far as the persona of Spider-Man and the actor playing him that Homecoming gets in a way that the Raimi trilogy does not, and that Tobey Maguire doesn't. I'm not sure Tobey Maguire is that kind of an actor.
Yeah.
That movie had to, again, serve a lot of masters, and it did it in a really good way. I think part of the reason why Spider-Man 2 works as well as it does is it serves no master but itself. It is a movie where Sam Raimi got to make the exact movie that he wanted to make, and without having to set up anything else, without having the studio mandate, and they were perfectly happy with Doc Ock being the villain. So they really weren't giving him a lot of notes, as far as I understand, and he just got to make the movie that he really wanted to make.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's where I started my comments on 2, it really was Sam Raimi free reigning it.
And it's his weird sense of humor that doesn't work in Spider-Man 3 works here again. Like being on the elevator and talking about why his costume rides up and itches. Like it's just like those weird moments that I love it. I love this movie. Again, I could really just talk moment by moment, the things that work, the few things that don't work, and I think they really are few and far between. I even like that Aunt May is really the one that gives him the inspirational speech that sets him back on the path, because that is the Aunt May character, right? Is she might not be aware of what the reality is. He doesn't need another father figure because Aunt May is that for him. She's the mom and the dad that he needed. And, all of these things I think are things that, that this movie understands. And, there's a reason why it's so beloved, even, after so many comic movies have come out since then. It just works. It just works on almost every level.
Okay, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that episode. We'll be back tomorrow night with part 2, in which we will discuss an in-depth dive into the canon of the Amazing Spider-Man books and bring you up to date on everything Spidey on the pages of the comic books. So, until then, please follow us on Twitter at BF Eat Pop Culture and at BMAZZ, that's BMAZZ 1008. Also, you can follow us on Instagram at Frank_Eat Pop Culture. And once again, BMAZ1008, or you can throw us an email at eatpopculture@gmail.com. Seriously, guys, reach out, ask a question, request a shout out. We're a small indie podcast. We cherish and enjoy any and all interactions. So we'd love to hear from you. And until we do, talk to you tomorrow night on part 2. Be well.